I am live. I continue reading out of Joan Marshall Grant's Speaking from the Heart, Ethics, Reincarnation and What It Means to Be Human, edited by Nicola Bennett, Jane Law and Sophia Rossoff. I'm here in her early years in chapter 1, from her birth until 1937. So it's her childhood where I am now, she wrote an autobiography about, what was it called? It was called Time Out of Mind, and a lot of it is in that particular book as well. But I still feel it would be good to put it in the context of extracts from this autobiography, which was published in 2007. I've already read a little bit of it, and I am continuing here. Okay. So, she talks about the governesses. She had many of them, and about her father and mother. And her father was an expert on the British mosquito. And his work is still available in the National History Museum in London. Some of the work was fun, surveying salt marshes before we constructed sluices and drainage ditches, or collecting larvae from unlikely breeding places, such as the knotholes in pine trees. I was in charge of the anophelines, which were kept in readiness to be infected whenever we heard of an active case of malaria. Then they were brought home and cosseted for 10 days before being taken, usually by me, to a mental hospital at Epsom, where they were used to transmit malaria to patients suffering from the advanced stage of general paralysis of the insane, a treatment then thought to be beneficial. I also had to do a great deal of laboratory work, which was rather tedious. For thousands of hours I peered down a microscope, counting the hairs on the terminal segments of larvae to determine their species, or counting the eggs in an egg raft. The test tubes of water I have analyzed for their salinity and hydrogen ion concentration would fill a sizable swimming bath. During this period, I tried, not very effectively, to keep my extrasensory faculties at bay. Experiences which were too vivid or too persistent to be shut out caused me comparatively little trouble, for then I had learned to be discreet. But by the time I was 19, I knew there was a clear choice open to me. I could try to increase the range of my supraphysical perception by cultivating my intuition and trusting that my critical intellect would keep me on the beam. Or I could try to bluff myself into believing that 9/10 of me did not exist. There were temptations in the second alternative, for sometimes it seemed rather bleak, taking full responsibility for what I was and what I would become, and it was difficult not to envy people who thought of themselves as part of a group, people who dodged their individuality by thinking of themselves as member of a family, or a nationality, or a class. But I knew that once I started to deny facets of myself, which I found inconvenient, I would have to construct a kind of laundry basket to hide them in, and into it I would soon throw grubby bits of me, which would remain useless and increasingly unattractive, because I was too slovenly to wash them. This was long before I heard of Freud's theory of the unconscious. So I chose the first alternative, which is obvious, for otherwise I would not be talking to you now. I had two main objectives. Firstly, to train myself to recall an earlier life in such complete detail that I would know as much about the earlier personality as I knew about Joan. I must teach myself how to do this recall at will, instead of having to rely on spontaneous flashes of memory. And I must choose a life of which my intellect knew nothing, or knew as little as possible. Secondly, I must learn how to increase my capacity to identify with other people, so that I might be able to use my far memory to recall relevant incidents from their earlier lives, if such incidents could contribute to my ability to help them to solve some specific problem. The first person Joan came across whom she could help in this way was Malcolm, a young man who had been unsuccessfully treated for a mental condition associated with a head injury that stumped the doctors. Malcolm was the identical twin of her husband-to-be, Leslie Grant. They were Argentinians of mixed Scottish and Spanish South American blood. According to Joan, it was in order to be able to take Malcolm away, safely out of the hands of his doctors, that she married Leslie in 1927. So she would be allowed to travel unchaperoned with the two brothers to a quiet spot in the south of France. Malcolm recovered and never had any kind of relapse, returning to London, where he was happy to serve as an escort to Joan in the guise of his brother, when Leslie pronounced himself bored with parties. As the roaring 20s danced to their close, Joan danced along with them, taking a cheetah with her to lunch at the Ritz, and conspiring with her best friend to make money by opening a Mayfair flower shop, until found out by their impecunious, deeply offended husband. Gillian, Joan's only child, was born in 1930 in an elegant, newly built townhouse called Ilchester Place, given to the young couple by Leslie's much-feared father. His offers of financial support came and went, as did Ilchester's Place, leaving the family struggling to find a home and an economically viable way of life. Mother and daughter returned to Hayling, staying with friends in Surrey and retreating to Scotland, while Leslie tried to forge his career as a bar barrister in London. Meanwhile, Joan was learning more and more about the 9/10 of herself that she did not want to bury. So, this was chapter 1, which I finish here because I do this chapter by chapter. Chapter 2 is entitled Psychometry. Have a lovely Monday, the 5th of August.